All right, so what do you say, Missy? We ready to go? All right, we're admitting a few more people here. Okay, well, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for the last evening, the last of four evening of the 11th Annual Agricultural Literacy Week. I am Jeanette Schaefer. I'm the Assistant State Librarian for Library Advancement, and the department sponsors and partners with NOFA, sponsors this event and partners with NOFA, and we're really happy about this collaboration, and it's always a lot of fun. So we're proud sponsors of these events, and I don't know how many years in a row, but it's been an ongoing successful collaboration. So Missy, do you want to talk about NOFA a little bit?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Missy Axelrod. I'm an ag engagement partner educator at NOFA Vermont, which is the Northeast Organic Farming Association. We're a statewide organization based in Richmond, usually. Most of us are all working from home now. We're a membership organization made up of about 1,100 farmers, gardeners, homesteaders, and food enthusiasts. Our mission is that we promote organic practices to build an economically viable, ecologically sound, and socially just Vermont agricultural system that benefits all living things. We have a bunch of different programs that we work with. I'll just name a few of them. Emmett is actually going to be going into more detail about food access later in the program. One of our programs is Farmer Services. We provide technical assistance to farmers and food producers. We're part of the Farm Viability Program, which is a really awesome program that supports farmers in extending their business deeper. We do education and engagement. We spread and build organic food movement by hosting annual winter conference every February. This year it will be virtual. Check it out on our website. We do on-farm workshops, pizza socials with our mobile pizza oven, and we do a lot of farm-to-school programming as well. Policy and advocacy is a huge part of our work. We make our voices heard at the State House, advocating for farmers and the environment. And we do the Vermont Organic Farmers certification as well. So if you see a label on an item at the grocery store, that's NOFA Vermont at work. Yeah, so a little bit about us.
Thanks, Missy. Okay, and we have a little video to share with you as well before we get started with our guests. So let me just go ahead and share that. And let me know in the chat if you have trouble with the sound.
My name is Jason Broughton. I'm the Commissioner of Department of Libraries and your State Librarian. I'd like to welcome you to Agricultural Literacy Week. In understanding Agricultural Literacy Week, it's important to understand why agricultural literacy is important to everyone, particularly from a library perspective. We're all about learning and literacy, and understanding how food is grown helps everyone understand the importance of where food comes from, how we consume it, how we dispose of it, and how it nourishes us. So it also helps farmers, those in agriculture, and all persons who want to make a life in growing food. In understanding that food helps communities in a variety of ways. One is resilience. To have a resilient community, one must have systems in place that can weather adversity. Food is one of those systems that we must understand. So I want to thank you for participating in this year's Agricultural Literacy Week, and I look forward to you joining our events. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Grace Odell, and I'm the Executive Director of NOFA Vermont. We're so glad that you're joining us for Agricultural Literacy Week. Ag literacy is critical to our work at NOFA in building a just, verdant, and ecologically thriving food system. Everyone needs to understand how food is grown, how it gets from the field onto your plate, all the people along the way who support that process. Understanding the how of how our food system works is so critical to transforming the food system we have to the food system we need. A community that's truly resilient is a community that's in right relationship with its place and its land, with the people who make up that community, and with its values. These offerings we're excited to share with you as part of this Agricultural Literacy Week are a small way of helping share some of our values with you and inviting you to join us. Thank you so much for joining. We hope you enjoy.
Okay, that was a little something from Jason and Grace, and Jason is actually here this evening. Welcome, Jason. So I think everybody has probably heard this Zoom 101 etiquette before, but I'll just go through it really quickly. So if you could mute yourself, unless you're talking, everybody is automatically muted, but when we do the Q&A later, you can unmute yourself and just remute yourself when you're done asking your question. Please post any questions in the chat if possible, and Missy and I will take a look at those and ask them if there's time in between the presenters, or we will save them for the end. Keep your video on if you'd like. We like to see you throughout the session. It's a little bit more engaging that way. But don't feel pressure to if you're more comfortable that way as well. And what else? Yes, we have an agricultural literacy reading and viewing list that we've assembled at the library, which I will post in the chat. And you can just kind of peruse that list if you want to do a little further reading. So now I'd like to introduce our panel, Tatiana, Ike, and Emmett, and some of the students from Bennington College. So take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here as part of Ag Literacy Week. My name is Tatiana Badamarco, and I teach food studies at Bennington College. The food studies program at Bennington College is run through our Center for the Advancement of Public Action. It's a community engaged food studies program. So what we try to do in all of our classes is to have a real connection to some aspect of our community. A lot of the time that's doing hands-on gardening work or hands-on work with our local food banks, but this is a really exciting opportunity to take part in some educational initiatives. So again, thank you to NOFA and to the Vermont Libraries for supporting us. Our class is an upper level class, so it's juniors and seniors at Bennington College, a few very special second year students as well. And we're studying gender and subsistence and agriculture in the class, but in particular, the students are going to share their work doing some qualitative interviewing around gender and food access and what they learned. And in that process, I'm so pleased to have the partnership of Isaac Leslie, who is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of New Hampshire and an expert very well published in the fields of gender and agriculture. He's a sociologist, and he collaborated with our class as we developed this qualitative interviewing project. So I hope you will enjoy the student presentation. Before we turn it over to the students, Ike's going to say a few words, but before that, I'm going to turn it over to Emmett Mosley, who's going to talk to you all about NOFA Vermont's food access programs.
All right, thanks, Tatiana. I do have a few slides here. I don't have a ton of time though, so I'm probably not going to bore you too much with all the details of these, but I just wanted to say a few words about sort of how we think about food access at NOFA that's maybe a little bit different than sort of other paradigms you might have encountered. So NOFA's food access work is situated pretty solidly within our market development department. So it sort of sits at the nexus of expanding access to local foods for as many people as possible, sort of regardless of income, while at the same time sort of ensuring that producers are still being fairly compensated for their product. So it's a sort of a different approach than you might have, than people might be familiar with from the sort of more charitable food system where you're talking about things like gleaning, harvesting excess produce, or sort of all of these non-market ways of getting food to people. So food pantries, soup kitchens, and other sort of direct food distribution. So what we're doing is, we're focusing, so we have two sort of main tracks that we do that through. One is through our sort of SNAP support. So we are kind of a clearinghouse of knowledge, connecting farmers markets and other direct market producers with technical support so that they can accept SNAP benefits, or 3 Squares Vermont benefits, as they're called in Vermont. And so we provide a lot of just one-on-one coordination to sort of ensure that SNAP benefits are accepted at about 40 farmers markets around the state, and a sort of ever-growing number of CSAs and farm stands and sort of online direct sales these days. So actually, if you want to just advance one more, we can talk about crop cash. So then sort of once, we build that infrastructure out, and then we're able to tap into funds through the Food Insecurity Nutritional Incentive Program through the USDA, which helps us double or triple the buying power of people using SNAP benefits at farmers markets and some select farm stands around the state. So basically, the participant comes in, swipes their EBT card, or tells the market manager that they have their funds deposited directly, and then they are matched in their first $10. They'll receive an extra $10 in a normal year, which they can use to purchase fruits, vegetables, or edible plant starts at that farmer's market or farm stand. This year, actually, because of the pandemic and to sort of meet the rise of food insecurity, we've actually doubled the incentive. So through the end of December, if you spend $10 in SNAP benefits at a farmer's market, you'll actually receive an extra $20. So if you were to go down to, say, the Bennington Farmers Market, through December, you can spend $10 and basically get $30 worth of local food. And of course, this is all sort of part of our market development strategy. So what we're trying to do is grow the number of people in the state who are accessing, participating in our direct local food economy. Vermont, you probably know, is sort of leading in the nation in this regard. I think we have the highest sort of percentage of sales that are direct. So, direct farmer to consumer, but it's still only about 10% of our food economy, which is pretty low. So there's a huge amount of potential for growth. But of course, there are economic and sort of other types of barriers for people. So these programs are sort of meant to be an access point for new people to enter into that direct market local food system. So that's a little bit about our SNAP work. And then if you want to skip ahead a couple slides, I can talk about Farm Share, which is a similar program, except for, one or two more. Sorry, there's a lot in this about crop cash. I didn't want to get into too much of all the details. Maybe one more. One more. There we go. So our Farm Share program is a statewide CSA subsidy program. This year, again, because of COVID, we've really expanded the program pretty significantly. So we're on track to support CSA shares for about 400 families around the state, so that people can have access to a CSA share at a 50% discount. Again, trying to sort of break down that economic barrier to people entering into the food system. And, sort of just because this is Agricultural Literacy Week, I feel like that's a sort of really important piece of why we emphasize direct sales. It's not just because there's a sort of circular economy perspective, but it has a lot to do with sort of tapping into producers as real sources of knowledge about, food culture, food history, ecological farming practices. There's really no better way to learn about a lot of these things than to have a direct relationship with the person who's producing your food, sort of on a day-to-day basis. If you're going to encounter foods through a CSA that maybe you're not used to, you have a person there to sort of guide you through that process. And you have a whole community that's built around that farm to sort of support this type of eating and these types of agricultural practices. So I feel like that's something really important to emphasize, and it's something that's pretty different than your sort of traditional charitable food system. And I think that that's something that's really valuable about NOFA's work. I've worked a lot in that charitable food system, and it's just a very different feel than sort of what we try to do, which is to really build relationships between eaters and the people who are producing their food. So at the risk of going over time here, I'm going to leave it there. Of course, I would be happy to talk to anybody further about these programs privately or to follow up later. If you want to learn more about what we're doing in your particular corner of the state, NOFA really does serve every county with these programs. So no matter where you are, there's a farmer or a farmer's market in your community or nearby that we're working with. So I'm always happy to talk to people more about these programs. Thanks so much.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ike, or Isaac Sohn Leslie. They are he. So I had the privilege of working with this class this week as they put the final touches on this presentation. And I'll be jumping in at the end of the slides to sort of tie together some of the themes that the students are going to present about. I'm an environmental sociologist, and my research focuses on how to build food supply chains that prioritize social justice and ecological sustainability. So this Monday, in just a few days, I'll be defending my doctoral dissertation at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you, Tatiana, which focuses on alternative food movements in Argentina and their strategies for building food economies for justice and sustainability. I'll then be starting as a postdoctoral researcher in food systems at the University of New Hampshire, where I'll be launching a project about increasing small and medium farm income and local and regional food production in New England. But the reason I'm here today is because I published a series of papers on the relationships between sustainability, gender, and sexuality. In particular, I interviewed queer farmers in New England to write about sort of three main areas. The first is queer farmers in New England, their experiences of rural and agricultural heterosexism. Two, their creative strategies for thriving as rural queer people in agriculture. And three, to see what does a queer lens on agriculture say about the role of sexuality and heteronormativity on cisgender and heterosexual farms. I'm also a queer farmer activist, and I participate in groups like the Northeast Queer Farmers Alliance. On a more personal note, I grew up in Shasbury, Vermont, and recently I was very fortunate to purchase farmland with my partner Wichiartu on El New Abenaki land here in Athens, where we'll be starting a queer and BIPOC focused farm. And so if you're interested in talking about any of those topics later, I'll put my contact info in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ike. And now for the main event, I'm gonna go ahead and do a screen share, and I will turn it over to the students who are going to give their presentation.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Kayla. I'm a junior at Bennington College. Just would like to thank NOFA for having us. We're incredibly excited to be a part of Ag Literacy Week. We are students from Gender, Subsistence, and Agriculture class taught by Tatiana, and we are here to present and share with all of you our research about gender in farming.
Hi, my name is Cass. I'm also a student, and just going off of what Kayla said. So our class is titled Gender, Subsistence, and Agriculture. And in this class, we are essentially consciously and critically analyzing the intersections of gender, subsistence, and agriculture with a specific focus on feminist theory. And at the end of this class, we each will have developed a workshop that is somehow related to food or farming in our community. Next slide.
Hello, my name is Ava Foreman. I'm a sophomore at Bennington College, and I was fortunate enough to be in Tatiana's class on food insecurity in Bennington last term, as well as this class on gender, subsistence, and agriculture. Well, looking at this topic, it is essential to understand that since the beginning of the pandemic, 1 in 4 Vermonters are dealing with food insecurity. While looking at this, statistically, some communities are much more vulnerable to food insecurity. These groups are people of color, those without a college degree, households with children, and women. This chart on the right shows the increased utilization of food assistance programs in 2020. In blue, we have the numbers from March when the pandemic first hit the United States, and in red, we have June. There's a clear increase in the use between there's a clear increase in use in the months between March and June. Next slide.
Hi, my name is Mari. I'm a sophomore. As Cass mentioned, intersectionality is the major focus of this class, and it doesn't really make much sense to see intersectional topics using only one field. So over the course of this class, we have engaged deeply with various disciplines of thought around gender and agriculture to provide a solid foundation for our research. Some readings were grounded in feminist theory and food justice from authors like Vandana Shiva, Shelley L. Koch, and Ashley Colby. Others provided foundational data and knowledge about the state of farming in this country today, like Ike Leslie, who we have here, Jacqueline Weipler, and Michael Mayerfield Bell's article on relational agriculture. These readings prompted us to think deeply about how, in particular, the work of women in farming is invisibilized, how the notion of farming and who is and isn't a farming interacts with norms around masculinity and gender, and also race, and the practice of subsistence and sustainable life practices outside of traditional engagement with the industrial food system. As such, some of the primary questions that have surfaced out of our readings include: how do capitalism and subsistence interact? How does subsistence and poverty interact more specifically? Who practices subsistence? Who identifies as a farmer or any other sort of related label like homesteader or gardener, etc.? And why or why not? And how do education and access to resources change the playing field? Many of these questions were later mirrored in our research when we spoke to local farmers and community members about their experiences with food, gender, and agriculture. Next slide.
Hi, my name is Kunlek, and today I'm gonna talk a little bit about our research project. The main aim of our research project was to learn about intersection between food access project and gender identity. In the class, we worked together to create a list of questions, and these questions were used by each student for their interview. We interviewed about 19 individuals from Southern Vermont. These people includes educators, local farmers, and people working in food access programs. From the interview notes, we brought up different themes, and today we'll be presenting 5 themes on the intersection between food access and gender identity. Next slide.
I'm Lily. I'm a freshman at Bennington. And after we completed our interviews, we kind of put all our notes together, and we found 5 themes that we thought were most prominent among all the interviewees. And those were food access, intersectionality, privilege, who is a farmer and farmer identity, and education.
Hi, my name's Dewey, and I'll start talking about food access as first theme. For those who are not familiar with the word, I'll just quote from Carleton College that food access means spatial accessibility and affordability of food retailers, specifically such factors as travel time to shopping, availability of healthy food, and food prices relative to the access to transportation and socio-economic resources of food buyers. As Eva has said earlier, since the beginning of the pandemic, 1 of 4 Vermonters are dealing with food insecurity, and most of them are talking about food access. And in our research, in our group, we spoke to a large realm of community members in the greater Bennington County that are involved: local farmers, individual gardeners, homesteaders, and non-government organizations. And after our research, we break down food access into three sections that could improve the current situation. First is growing food. Of course, one of the simplest ways for folks to access good food is to grow it themselves. But there are many like challenges in reality. First, farming and gardening requires knowledge, skills, land access, and commitment and time. It is especially hard for women and Black, Indigenous people and people of color and those who receive lower education. And in general, the smaller the scale is, the harder for it to farm sustainably and feed people. Um, and home gardeners and subsistence growers have to rely on other food sources besides their own production. And smaller farms are hard to compete with larger farms, and especially those um, are doing intensive industrial farming. And for example, Burley Farm in Hoosick Falls, New York, has 600 acres. They're doing a pretty good job. You know, they produce meat, dairy, and vegetable. And this farm is like they have very low outside input, means they produce compost, mulch, and hay all by themselves. But this model is hard to copy by many smaller farms or home gardeners or like social organizations. And also, when the scale is smaller, the average cost is always higher. And I know many people are doing well as they can have supplemental food resources on their own. And for others, the barrier I just mentioned above still exists and keep them away from producing their own food. I just quote from a local farmer: the best way to make quality food accessible and affordable is to have a farm in each community and produce for its people. And I believe this is a crucial process in building a healthy and thriving food system for communities, not for markets. Um, I mean, again, there's always barriers. And another thing I want to talk about here is preserving food, uh, which is kind of, you can say it's part of growing food, but it also has some other how to say meaning in it. It is an important thing, especially for somewhere like Vermont that has shorter growing season. And if we do it properly, preserving food will help a lot for people to save money, especially for healthy food if you just do it at home, and also reduce food waste. So in general, it can enrich food access if people can do it properly. And just like growing food, preserving food, it's a little easier than um, growing food for people to do it at home or do it on themselves. But it also requires knowledge, equipment, infrastructures, and time and commitment, which could be hard for many families. So in general, residents need more information and resources to help them to accomplish this goal. And another thing is accessing healthy food. Whether the resource of food access currently available in Bennington is enough is debatable, especially for those who really rely on food programs. Executive Director of PAVE, which stands for Project Against Violent Encounter, Nadia Luchin, and she believes that the resources for food access currently available in Bennington are enough to meet the needs of her clients, including those in food shelves and food pantries. But other community members disagree that they just think it doesn't really meet their need. And according to one community member that participated in the summer garden program, she shared that the food pantries that she has been to in the past had little food that her and her children would eat essentially. That she thought that another reason she budgets well is because she realized that those things are not really reliable, which is kind of sad. And on just these issues, Nadia, from the perspective of food program, she suggested that the bigger issue is connecting food insecure survivors with those existing resources. And primary barriers to access is lack of transportation and narrow pickup windows. So to increase public transportation and a greater disbursement of pickup locations and better system for delivering food directly to clients might help reduce these barriers. And also there are some people said there are not plenty of choices on fresh produce, while the majority of the food pantries are like instant food and cans. And of course, people have various food resources. You don't have to get fresh produce at food programs. You know, they can get food from different locations, but it's still important to really have fresh produce accessible for many people who really don't have other resources. And meanwhile, some people from the food programs also said that fresh produce are not the most popular thing at food pantries, which is another problem about food culture in the US, that people sometimes just love or just used to junk food. And that's, you know, that's what some people grew up eating, and some people don't know how to cook healthy food. No, I know I'm going a little bit far from this, so let's go back to healthy food access. Another thing is another barrier to have healthy food and fresh produce is that they normally cost more to be produced than like fast food or processed food. And these organizations are, or just many food programs are rely heavily on governmental appropriation and donations. So sometimes you can't ask them to do a lot more. And this just brings back to the importance of growing food and preserving food on your own, you know, and the challenges are still the lack of information and resources. So it will be a long run to build up a whole thriving food system, and we have to, you know, do it little by little, and meanwhile overcoming many other challenges like racism and gender inequality and other topic my fellow students will talk about later. So you can go to the next page. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Hi, I'm Fiona, and I'm going to talk about one of the other themes that we discussed, which is intersectionality. So what is intersectionality? Kimberly Crenshaw, a leading scholar in critical race theory, developed the theory of intersectionality in 1989 in order to address the ways in which the experiences of women of color, specifically Black women, were often left out of feminist and anti-racist rhetoric. Kimberly Crenshaw positions that systems of oppression often intersect to shape distinct experiences in life, according to the overlapping identities one holds. Her theory has been expanded to encompass other intersection axes such as class, sexuality, and location. In connection with food access and farming, the theory of intersectionality influences the way people who are systemically oppressed access economic and social capital that is necessary for acquiring the land, tools, knowledge, and resources that is needed for farming and food access. It is important to think about intersectionality when addressing issues of food insecurity, as well as the allocation of resources to help start or maintain farms run by queer, femme, non-binary, BIPOC individuals. One participant says, "I'm a brown woman of color in Vermont. I often feel like I have to work much harder than some of my other colleagues, whether they are male or female and are white. I speak a certain way and behave a certain way, and I dress a certain way because in our society, we have systemic racism at every level, and that's how you get through things." Another participant says, "The way that sexuality in agriculture plays out is really dramatic. If we were a hetero couple, we would probably have started our farm 5 years ago." Each brings up the point of who is considered to be a real farmer, a topic we will address later, and how there are certain safety nets and privileges put in place for the people who are white, well-educated, heterosexual, and married. Next slide.
Hi, I'm Emma, and I'm going to be talking about our third theme, which is privilege. So, to define privilege, it is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. So, this goes really great with what Fiona was just saying, but particularly going off of advantage, Vermont is almost the whitest state in the country, with approximately 95% of its population being white. So, obviously, white people definitely have an advantage over every other race when it comes to pretty much anything in the state, but agricultural things specifically. We found that a few of our interviewees said Vermont is a great place to be a woman in agriculture, but we were discussing, does that apply to a woman who isn't white? And then also, what does that mean for non-binary people? So thinking about privilege in this context is really, really important. There are so many intersections of privilege, as Fiona was just saying, and gender and race intersect very heavily in our findings, because we found that being a white woman in Vermont was really wonderful in terms of agriculture, according to our interviewees. But for, I think, the one female person of color who was interviewed, we have a quote from her saying, "I am one of very few people of color that farms in Vermont, and I suspect that throughout the country you would find that many farmers are not people of color or Indigenous people." And I try to bring that perspective to the table. I try to use my privilege as a college-educated brown female who has reached a certain level of socioeconomic power to reach behind and open up opportunities for other women. So it's not always easy to be a woman in agriculture in Vermont. And it's interesting that this woman brought up socioeconomic power and college education, because another aspect of privilege is access to education and socioeconomic status, and how often in higher education institutions, that is often where the realization happens for a lot of people that like food insecurity is a thing and that it is important. And so often it is in these higher education formats, in these spaces, where people realize that privilege isn't equal. And so it's interesting how that can be a catalyst for realization, and how you need a certain level of privilege to access this thought. And then we were also discussing how in such a small state as Vermont, where being local and being a Vermonter is so important, this can lead to exclusivity, because who is a Vermonter, who is local, and who looks like a Vermonter? And if people assume in the Northeast, in small towns, that white people are the locals and white people would be the Vermonters. And so these questions, these values, can lead to exclusion. Next slide, please.
Hi, I'm Lua, and here we want to transition into thinking a bit more about the farmer identity. First, we ask you to picture who a farmer is in your own mind. Where do they work? How do they work? And what communities are they a part of? Here we want to engage this question further through looking at some patterns we found in our research. First, we found that there's a lot of variation in who identifies as a farmer and who doesn't. Some people who don't identify with the term farmer feel that they can't identify with the term because of other identities in their life. One of our interviewees said, "I'm not allowed to call myself a farmer, period." And even still, as a woman, I don't call myself a farmer even though I've been farming for 10 years. I don't use that label because nobody I've ever really met can truly see it. Like if I use that word, I see in everybody's eyes like, oh, great. We also found that many women who work in agriculture do experience gender-based prejudice, but that this is not necessarily a universal experience. For some, there is an assumption for the people who work on the farm that men are more likely to know how to do things like use machinery and power tools. Some have also experienced ideas of the farmer's wife and being cast as the farmer's wife, which makes assumptions about the role of women and their labor on farms. One of our interviewees noted that dairy farming has a lot less female farmers, and she often finds that when she's in public, the attitude is, oh, it's the farmer's wife, and she feels that this negates all the work that she does. On the flip side, though, one of our interviewees talked about how she sees farmer Beatrice Burrell as being perceived, saying, Beatrice Burrell, she's a real farmer. I mean, everybody who's ever shook her hand, they'll think, wow, what a handshake she has. I didn't really think what an amazing woman. Rather, what an amazing farmer. Next slide.
My name is Uliana, and I want to be talking about adaptable education within food systems, and it's tied to accessibility. So some of the topics that were talked about in the interviews that we did in relation to education and it's tied to accessibility are sharing holistic education of farming with younger generation. And I want to highlight the importance of practice in this. And so one of our interviewees said, you get the kids out into the dirt when they're little and educate them on, hey, it's actually fun to grow your own carrots and eat them. Another theme or topic that came up was knowledge and skills about farming and making, which is cooking, canning, etc., and understanding of soil science, education and accessibility to land, and money used within food systems. And here I want to stress cooking as needed knowledge to every human being. One of participants said, you're gonna learn to cook the more you cook. If you learn to learn, if you're one of the lucky ones and you've learned how to learn, then you don't have to continuously follow directions. Another topic within education is shift in food culture landscapes towards sharing and recognizing food as a communal aspect in our lives. One of our participants from Edible Brattleboro said, we're really trying to encourage people to help themselves, you know. It took them about 2 years before people even started to harvest stuff because they couldn't believe we're giving away that stuff for free, you know. So the culture is now to shift, which is what the intention was, to really just shift the culture of sharing, and the food is really part of commons and it should be accessible to everyone. Another topic was communal learning, and that also ties to communal learning and community building. Among that, we also heard a lot about nutritional deficiency and also about chronic diseases that are related to food and nutrition. In all of this, we want to recognize that education is a crucial part of food systems. However, knowledge needs to be transferred in a sustainable way that fosters engaged communities. To do this, we believe that education should always be in conjunction with resources, meaning teach a concept only if you can supply the tools and materials with a commitment to educating people on how to utilize them. At the same time, we want to ask questions of how peer-to-peer education can be used to strengthen communities. And furthermore, how can the educational system be adaptable to a changing environment? And here I want to mention some educational projects in the area. which is Edible Brattleboro, the Susu Healing Collective, Retreat Farm at Brattleboro, the Putney School, among others. Next slide, please.
And just with some conclusions and takeaways, just an overview of what we did. After interviewing all these workers in Vermont, talking about the intersection of farming and gardening and food access, we came up with these themes, and we concluded that both Vermont and the local food movement are constructed as white spaces, and that is both problematic and incorrect. There needs to be a need to create land access for BIPOC farmers in the state. Next slide.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I want to say thank you to the class. This is a really monumental feat in order to you collaboratively designed, implemented, and presented on a qualitative research project in just 7 weeks. So kudos to that. So I'm going to pick up on and tie together some of the themes from the presentation, and I'm going to do so around the question that Lua brought up earlier, which is, who is a farmer? I'm going to talk about a few additional ways that this question is gendered, this question is racialized, and this question is sexualized, and how this relates to socially marginalized farmers' experiences and also to food insecurity. So to add to a little bit to how the students discussed how this question is gendered, like they mentioned, we normally think of men as farmers, but it's important to remember that the majority of women's farmers are actually women. And that these ideas that tie masculinity to agriculture are not natural, but they're a social invention. So an example of that is there's one of my favorite scholars, Dr. Gabriel Rosenberg at Duke University, has done some really excellent work on the history of the USDA, literally having to teach women farmers through programs like 4-H to not think of themselves as farmers, but instead think of themselves as housewives. And so that's just one example of this gendered socialization, which is so strong that in the United States, the USDA did not even start collecting information on gender in the ag census until 1978. And so like some of the students mentioned, today, many women who farm do not even claim that farmer title. And so census statistics continue to underrepresent the amount of women actually engaged in agriculture. But it's also important to talk about masculinity here, because there's some really interesting research out there about how dominant ways of performing masculinity get in the way of transitioning to sustainable agriculture. For example, hegemonic masculinity as performed by certain men farmers promotes ideas or like very gendered ideas of who should do what work on the farm. Many of these men farmers have resistance to admitting mistakes, an inclination to do things that are more about controlling nature versus working with nature. And sometimes folks have really gendered ideas of what success looks like on farms, like bigness or the use of expensive machinery. Next, how this question is racialized. When we think of who is a farmer, what we're really talking about most of the time is who owns or who manages a farm, not necessarily the people who are actually doing the farm work. And in Vermont, most farm owners are white, but also in this state, it is often BIPOC folks and migrant workers who are the backbone of our prized dairy industry and of many organic farms. And so when we're talking about how white Vermont is, according to census data, let's also remember that those numbers do not account for these BIPOC folks in the food system or beyond it. This question is also sexualized. Sometimes this one's a little harder for people to wrap their heads around. But think about common discourse around a family farm, which we hear all the time because according to the USDA, 97% of farms in the US are family farms. But what does that really mean? It does not have anything to do with farm size or type of production or sustainability, although there are many folks who would lead you to think so. Rather, the way I see it is that a family farm is where someone's agricultural business partner on the one hand is also their intimate or sexual partner on the other hand. And when we think of farm families, are we thinking of queer people, queer families? My point here is that the family farm is a heteronormative vision of agriculture that excludes a lot of ways that queer people make families and a lot of ways that queer people build farms. And really importantly, you have to see that family farms, there's an economic viability aspect here. Family farms rely on an intimate partner in order to support the business, like either directly through labor or wealth, or oftentimes indirectly through off-farm income or access to things like health insurance. And these dominant family structures exclude single people, and queer folks in particular often have a much more difficult time finding queer partners in rural areas, because despite common ideas about Vermont being welcoming to queer folks, my research has shown that heterosexism is pervasive in Vermont. And it's important to say that this limiting vision of the family farm is one that agricultural groups from all political persuasions reproduce, including organics. So why does it matter who we think of as a farmer? Among many other things, it matters for farm economic viability, especially through accessing loans and grants through places like the Farm Service Agency and the Natural Resources Conservation Association. Because farmers' ability to get those grants depends on that grant officer interpreting that farmer as a real or a legitimate farmer. And if that person does not think of a farmer as a woman or a person of color or a queer person, they're less likely to offer them grants and loans, which is exactly what has been happening and is why the USDA has lost some really big lawsuits in the last 20 years for discriminating against socially marginalized farmers. And seemingly paradoxically, the most marginalized farmers and their families in the world are often food insecure themselves. And we often talk about food insecurity as an economic issue and not enough, but we sometimes talk about food insecurity as a racial issue, but it's also an issue particularly for trans, genderqueer, and queer people. And food insecurity varies at the intersection of queerness and race. So some interesting statistics from the Williams Institute show that 13% of white cisgender heterosexual people in the US are food insecure, compared to 21% of white LGBT people. And that number doubles if you are both Black and LGBTQ. 42% of Black queer people in the US have not had enough money for food sometime this last year. That's nearly half. So in conclusion here, despite common narratives about Vermont being a welcoming liberal state, this research shows that rural sexism, racism, and heterosexism are structurally pervasive in Vermont and in Vermont's food systems, and we need to treat that as such if we're going to take the idea of food justice seriously. Thank you.
Now, of course, this is just the surface of what we began exploring in this presentation, and we have come up with 3 further questions that we hope you all can think about. So one being, how do we integrate gender identity, being feminine, masculine, non-binary, queer, into our individualized farming practices? 2, what would it look like to trust and to resource already existing BIPOC-led food and farming organizations in Vermont, such as Susu Community Farm in Brattleboro? There's a lot of momentum around local food access here in Vermont. Would the model work in other regions? Is there a way to export it or spread it more widely? And that is the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening, and we hope you all took away something from it.
Thank you so much. And now we're going to open up to Q&A and discussion.
And you're welcome to put your questions in the chat or just unmute yourself. I think we can manage the actual talking in this group as well.
So I had a question about when Ike was talking about why women farmers don't consider themselves as farmers. Is that something they're just holding back from doing because they feel it would diminish their identity, or like why do they feel the need to not identify as a farmer?
I feel like I can speak on that a little bit. I think that a big part of that is that many people feel that their identity doesn't fit the farmer stereotype. And so by having to claim themselves as a farmer, they have to kind of sacrifice other identities. And one of those may be like their femininity or masculinity.
And I'll just jump in with a few specific things related to the ag census is that many types of women's work or traditionally women's work in agriculture, including caring for the home, raising poultry, and raising food for self-provisioning are not counted as agricultural activities necessarily. So it's both about like these ideas and discourses like Lily was talking about, that socialize folks into thinking of farmers a particular thing or another, but it's also about the ways that our agricultural institutions have been made and remade over the years.
Yeah, and adding on to Ike and Lily's points, from the interviews that I read, the impression that I got is that because farmers within the community that these, like mostly women, were working in did not consider them farmers, they were sort of like made into this like other category, if that makes sense. So it's like you're not a farmer, you're also like not a farmer. So you're kind of stuck in like this limbo where you're growing food, you're tending to the land, but you're never really considered a farmer because you're female, you're queer, you're a person of color. So it's not necessarily like I'm not blaming anybody for not considering themselves a farmer because that is extremely silly, but it's more so because the social expectations around a farmer is imposed on these people, like consciously and subconsciously. Um, like it's never really expressed that they can identify as a farmer, if that makes sense.
I actually have a question. So have you seen, probably Ike, in your studies, that farmers, BIPOC farmers or LGBTQ plus farmers are held back in their ability to also expand? I think I saw a quote from somebody who said that they would have started farming years ago if they'd been heterosexual. So have you also seen that they weren't as well funded or had access to loans and all of that when they needed to expand into maybe a canning infrastructure or distribution infrastructure? So are you seeing that those farms are kind of stuck in the small realm rather than being able to go larger?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Yeah, my research on this topic shows that there's really 4 areas that are crucial to farm economic viability that are also plagued by heterosexism. And that's access to land, access to labor, access to credit to build infrastructure, and access to knowledge. So in all of these areas, farmers often rely on an intimate partner and oftentimes marriage in order to access those things. Now, marriage was not legal until very recently for queer folks, and still marriage does not reflect the way that many queer folks want to and do build queer families. And it continues to be exclusionary to single people and polyamorous folks. So through the way that queer people, well, that all people use relationships, use intimate relationships in order to access these key resources that they need to start farms, because of heterosexism in both interpersonal ways and institutionalized ways, queer folks often take a whole lot longer in order to access the capital, find a partner, find a community that they feel safe in. To give an example related to knowledge access and how that has come up repeatedly in my studies and how it's particularly relevant to the organic farming community, is a lot of queer farmers I spoke with talked about really awful experiences that they've been put through by being paired with cisgender and heterosexual mentor farmers, and then being trapped on that farm in both a living situation and a working situation with very little housing or job security, and having to remain in the closet or otherwise be oppressed in those scenarios. So it's not a surprise to me that when I interview out queer farmers, they are getting more and more calls for apprenticing on their farms than they can handle, because queer folks and especially trans and gender non-binary folks are looking for places in rural areas where they can farm, not be oppressed, and also live in queer community. And until we see strong rural queer communities, and until we see equitable resource access, especially in those 4 areas, access to farming is going to continue to be heterosexist. And of course, that's exacerbated at the intersection of race.
Thanks so much. Actually, I have another question. So unless anybody else wants to jump in, on the questions to ponder slide, the last question was, could Vermont be a sort of a testing ground or a model that could be expanded to the rest of the country? I think that's how I'm interpreting it or remembering it. I'd love to hear some thoughts on what you think the answer to that could possibly be, that question, and putting it out to everybody here.
Well, I'll jump in for this one. Not that, I think it's going to take, one of the reasons we ended with those questions is that we all need to think a bit about them, because we don't have the answers. So we need to all put our minds to work on that. But I think one of the things that we can do about what's working here in Vermont, and we do have things working in our smaller scale of our state, and with our supportive state government and Vermont Farm to Plate and NOFA Vermont, and we have these institutions in place, is really just promoting that to other people and making sure the word gets out about what is working here, so that it can be replicable other places. And I really do think this happens at the community level, and that we're not going to necessarily find a one-size-fits-all solution. But the more we can get into other communities and share our stories and use media, especially to share the stories of what's working, the more it can become an inspiration to others.
Has Michael Heffernan's question been answered?
Can you read it, Mari?
Yeah. How can we be more of an open community and tear down that wall? How could we help queer farmers get the equality they deserve? And I think we will need replicable models of free food distribution and growing food cheaply on smaller scales, which I feel like is related to animal agriculture, the absence of it, which I agree with. But to answer Michael's question, or just like to begin to answer Michael's question, like you can't really, like, I feel like it's unwise to go just like category by category, if that makes sense. Like there are ways to specifically include queer farmers, but also like you need to make sure that you're very intersectional about that approach, right? Because I read an interview with this person is perceived as female, right? They're actually non-binary, but they are perceived as female and they have a female partner. And they said that they specifically felt like the community was less welcoming to them because that community did not understand lesbianism as well as they understood being, you know, a male gay man with a male partner. So, like, you have to welcome everyone when you welcome one specific group of people. And I think that seems like a no-brainer in some aspects, but also, like, I think just with my personal experience within certain groups, like, people often think that inclusion comes at the price of exclusion, right? Like, we want to encourage more of X type of people to come, but then they don't consider that X type of people also includes like this intersection. I hope that was understandable. But yeah, it's more so like I think Vermont and other very white areas need to remember that like they are not on neutral ground, that being white, cisgender, heterosexual, upper middle class, etc., is not neutral ground at all. Like, it has a history of its own that must be acknowledged. So I hope that began to answer it. But I think acknowledging that history is a good first step and not necessarily with shame, because I think that's very counterproductive.
I'd like to pick up on that question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I saw Uliana had their hand up.
I mean, I just wanted to add to what Mari was saying about, yeah, how can we build an open community? I've been thinking about that a lot, and I honestly came to a conclusion that we need to talk to each other. And I feel like this is what we're doing here through these kind of groups as well. But honestly, it comes down to the fact that we don't, we rarely talk to each other. And when we do, we lack skills to create spaces, to create safe spaces for each other. Like in daily interactions, and especially in interactions with people who have different ideas than we do. And so, and like I see that in the United States a lot, and it is embedded in the culture, unfortunately, that we don't talk to people, or here there's not a culture that people can openly talk to other people without a reason, you know? And I really think that this is a big start.
Ike, before you go, can I add on one more thing? Thanks, dude. But so I think in our position as, like, you know, many of us are in a place of privilege, some of us are not, but I think we also need to accept that sometimes people who belong to a minority group that we do not belong to want their own space. Like, for example, I have many transgender friends, and sometimes there are things that they want to talk about, like, on their own. And I think as a more privileged cis person, like, I think there's that sort of knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, why not me? I thought I was one of the good ones, but that needs to be like ignored, you know? So if somebody wants to start like a farm that's run by Black people or in Vermont, or one that's only run by queer people in Vermont, like, if you're not a part of that group, like, I think fighting that, oh, why not me feeling is really key, because, you know, people need their own space to figure out what to do. Now, if they ask for help, like, I think that's where the place of people who are more privileged comes in. But like Liana says, that involves just talking to each other and being open to the idea that, yes, you can run a farm like entirely with women or entirely with POC. So yeah, like I said, I think it comes down to communication. And like, when we question like, oh, why aren't straight people on your farm, we also need to question, well, why aren't queer people on other farms? So maybe it's a little bit like radical for some people here, but it's just the thought that I had.
So I'd love to pick up on some of those points and look at them on an organizational level. So absolutely reinforcing on an interpersonal level, this intersectional approach, like y'all have been describing. But how do we do this on an organizational level, like with a NOFA, for instance? Now, the common rhetoric here is diversity and inclusion. And I really want us to take a moment to think about that, what that means. And I'm not singling out NOFA in general here, this is organizations across the board right now for the most part. But what diversity and inclusion really means most of the time is starting from a foundation of an organization which has a white supremacist culture and a heterosexist culture, and saying we need to bring in and include folks from marginalized groups into our dominant culture without changing that dominant culture. And then we're done with the work. What that does is it puts socially marginalized people in harm's way, and it doesn't do the work of undoing the white supremacy, the institutionalized sexism and heterosexism of the organization that reproduces the whiteness and the heterosexism of the space in the first place. So whenever the question is asked, is like, what do we do for like folks of a marginalized group? I always want to turn that question around and say, what do we do as people from dominant groups to work on our own internalized white supremacy, sexism, heterosexism, et cetera? Because when we work on that as folks from dominant groups, marginalized folks might just feel more included. Now, the flip side to the diversity and inclusion approach, it might be a more liberatory model. Now, what would it look like if we really trusted the already existing BIPOC, queer, women, et cetera, led organizations that are already doing this work? We exist. We're here in Vermont. We're everywhere. And we are vastly under-resourced. So I think a truly liberatory model, and if we really want to change things, it's about putting resources in the pocket of BIPOC, queer, for instance, led organizations, like, for example, the Susu Healing Collective, like, for example, the Northeast Queer Farmers Alliance.
And Eva, you had your hand up. You took it down again. I don't know if you want to chime in.
Oh, that was just me. That was the clapping reaction. That was just.
Oh, clapping. Okay, thank you. We did have a comment.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say I would like to sort of chime in as the NOFA person here, because we're here. It's sort of I'm in sort of like reflecting on this question of like, what is the Vermont model and should we be exporting it? And I think the answer is probably not. I don't think that we have really figured anything out to its sort of ideal state at all. And I think so much of sustainable farming as it is right now is sort of living out a legacy of the Back to the Land movement, which had a lot of really problematic features of basically people with cultural and economic resources moving here and buying cheap land and then sort of holding on to that and not seeing it as a sort of liberatory framework, despite a lot of the rhetoric around it. And it is something that NOFA is working on right now. I mean, we're working on this sort of whole justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion statement as a staff, and a big sticking point that comes up, which is sort of how do we share power? How do we unlearn the sort of culture of resource and power hoarding that is sort of embedded in these longstanding organizations who have sort of claimed the right to speak on behalf of the small and sustainable farming movement. And it's still an unanswered question within our staff, and we're talking about it pretty deeply, and I think doing work there. And I think that trying to take it as a sort of liberatory, trying to center a liberatory mindset rather than just how do we make it seem like we're including other people in our pre-existing power structure, which it sort of comes out of a really problematic history in a lot of ways, is a really important way to think about it. But we don't have we don't have the answers yet, but these exact questions are things that are being discussed daily, sort of within our organization. And I'm relatively new to NOFA. I've worked there for less than a year or so, but I guess I'm just going to put out there that we're working on it, and we're having some pretty difficult conversations, and we're calling in outside facilitators to offer criticism and to try to be open to that change. But I think it is important to sort of hear those voices from the outside, because it can be a very insular type of conversation, because there is a lot of power and there is a lot of resources at stake when you really think about sort of what you need to do as an organization to move forward and to center justice. And giving up power is hard, and it's sort of the opposite of what people in our field have been sort of acculturated to do. So, for what that's worth.
Other questions, comments?
I want to briefly bring up the point about land, because that's kind of where my mind's been going lately. As Ike pointed out, here on Bennington 2, where we're on El New Abenaki land, the Abenaki never ceded this land to anyone. There's no treaties for it. Nobody handed it over. Legally or otherwise. And the Abenaki were also the main focus of the Vermont eugenics campaign, which sterilized many Abenaki women and significantly decreased the ability for them to even have children and pass on legacies. The Abenaki have a stronger and stronger voice after successfully winning a battle against the state of Vermont in the 1990s, who tried to say that they didn't even exist in the state anymore. So, we have these indigenous people here whose land it is, but then on top of that, we have a colonial land ownership structure and land. Most farmers, at least in Bennington County, they have their land because they inherited that land or they had access to money from family. That's something that especially queer folk a lot of the time don't have. BIPOC folk have much less access to capital. So that's that family inheritance, passing on land, that kind of thing. If we're not correcting that, then, those problems persist. And I see an interesting opportunity in Vermont's future. For better or worse, dairy is sunsetting, at least large dairy in Vermont. And that means large farms are going to become more and more available. And a lot of that transfer of land is being facilitated by land trusts. And I just wonder about the conversations we could be having with land trusts about how they get that land, who gets that land. Can it be split up in ways that it becomes manageable again, as for small farms? Are there ways to facilitate BIPOC and queer access as a reparation, and Abenaki access as well, as reparations for the harms that have been brought against these various people? Because that would go a long way. Giving people land would go a long way.
Additional questions. Okay, Joy. Joy says, pulling out a book from our book list that speaks to privilege in the Back to the Land movement with relevance today too. So Joy is posting a link there. Hi, Joy. She's one of our colleagues at the State Library. So there's a good read there to look at. And but there are other questions, comments. We have a few more minutes to go. Okay. Well, seeing none, I think I can speak for Missy that this was really helpful and gave us a lot to think about. And I really appreciate your time and doing this presentation, and also appreciate the amount of work that went into it in such a short time as well. So thank you so much, everybody. And oh, there's more stuff happening on the chat right now. So let's see. Trevor says, Trevor went to Bennington College. It's good to see this kind of research happening. I bought 3 acres with my partner. I'm white, had some family money. I know I'm unceded. I'm on unceded Abenaki land that was fought over bitterly and then made white by eugenics, by the eugenics program. I very much want to be in a land trust that will provide direct access to land for BIPOC for the indeterminate future. I want my land to provide food and housing for other people as well as myself. Thank you, Trevor. Sorry about the choppy reading, it's late. Ike just posted another resource as well. And thanks for the question, Eva, about the book list. Joy just posted it again. So with that, we should probably call it a night. Missy, any final words?
Yeah, I just wanted to let everybody know that we did record this, so we'll have this available. I believe it'll be emailed out to everybody so you can share it with friends and family. Thank you so much, everybody, for the work that you've done and for sharing it, and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.